In October of 1974, a 40-year-old oil driller named Carl Higdon from Riverton, Wyoming, found himself with an unexpected day off from work.
The bullet don't look right. There's somebody. Strange. He wants me to go with him. Lights are bright. Lights are. Uh, I can't keep my eyes open. I can't see. They look like me. Same features. He said the sun burns him. He's gonna take me back.
Just let yourself go back inside the cubicle. What happens inside the cubicle?
Oh, I can't get in. There ain't no door.
Do you know how you get in?
No. We're above the trees. I can see pretty good. The ball looks like a basketball, but it's got a blue gray outline. It's kind of dark. No lights. There's the lights again. Uh, we're back.
Did you ride in that spacecraft you described to me?
Yes.
In my own personal opinion, I find with the cases I've investigated that there seems to be no evidence of hoax. There seems to be no evidence of a psychotic reaction which has caused the individual to falsely believe that he or she has had an abduction, so that I'm left with the mysterious and sometimes uncomfortable feeling that the cases are happening as the individuals described. That is, that they are being taken on board, examined, and released by intelligent beings who, for their own reasons, are engaging in these experiences.
It was Friday, the 25th, and like any outdoorsman with a free day and a new rifle, he decided to go elk hunting. He packed his 7mm Magnum, got in his pickup truck, and headed south toward McCarty Canyon, about 40 miles from the small city of Rawlins. The day began like any other hunting trip. On his way, he stopped to help two fellow hunters whose truck had broken down. Over coffee, they suggested he'd have better luck deeper in the woods, so he took their advice and drove to the northern edge of Medicine Bow National Forest. He parked on a hill, had a brief chat with a game warden who happened to be there, and around 4 p.m. he grabbed his rifle and started walking into the forest. He hadn't walked more than a mile when he came to a clearing. There, about a few hundred feet away, stood 5 elk. They were completely still. Carl raised his rifle, aimed at the largest male, and pulled the trigger. But nothing happened the way it should have. There was no sound.
So I walked down over this hill. Whenever I got over the hill, I seen these 5 elk standing down there. One of them was a big bull, so I raised my gun to shoot.
The bullet left the barrel in slow motion, traveled about 50 feet, and then stopped, as if it had hit an invisible wall, before dropping into the snow. The elk didn't even flinch. The entire forest was unnaturally silent. Confused, Carl walked over and picked up the bullet. When he looked up, he noticed something odd on the ground. A large, transparent box, about 5 feet high, 5 feet wide, and 7 feet long. It looked like it was made of glass, and it was completely empty. Then, Carl felt a presence nearby. He turned around and saw a humanoid figure floating upright in the air, just a few feet away. It was wearing a black suit that looked like a scuba diver's gear. Carl estimated it was about 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed around 180 pounds. Its skin was like that of an East Asian person, and its face was human-like, but with no chin, and a severely receded jaw. It had no eyebrows, no visible ears, and small, slanted eyes. Its hair was coarse and straw-colored, sticking straight out from its head like bristles on a broom, grouped into small bunches spaced about half an inch apart. On top of its head were 2 distinct rods that looked like antennas. The being wore black shoes and a wide belt with a 6-pointed star where the buckle should be, and below that, a yellow symbol on a small apron. Its legs were noticeably bowed outward. What really caught Carl's attention was that it had no hands. Instead, a cone-shaped appendage or device stuck out from its right sleeve. The entity moved toward Carl by floating over the snow, not leaving any footprints. When it got within a few feet, it spoke. Its lips never moved, but Carl heard a voice asking, "Are you hungry?" Carl said yes. Then a small envelope or packet containing 4 pills floated toward him, and the entity told him to take one. Carl was normally very reluctant to take pills, but he later said he felt controlled, as if he had no choice but to swallow it. Then the entity asked if he wanted to go with it. Carl replied, "I might as well." He later explained that he had read about UFO encounters before, and had always told himself that if he ever met aliens, he would go with them. The entity pointed its cone-shaped appendage at Carl, and suddenly, everything changed. Carl's next memory was being inside that transparent rectangular box, which itself seemed to be inside a larger transparent structure, both still sitting in the forest. He was sitting in a bucket seat, with his arms and head restrained. Looking at the reflection on the glass above him, he could see the 5 elk standing motionless in a cage. The entity from the forest was in the room, along with 2 more similar beings. Carl said, "You've got my elk," and one of the beings just shrugged. Then the box lifted off the ground. Carl looked down and saw his truck where he had left it. But then the main entity waved its hand, and the truck disappeared from view. His next memory was seeing what he described as a blue ball and a huge marble in the distance far below him. He believed it was Earth. The beings told Carl they were going home, which they said was 163,000 light-miles away. They put a helmet on him with 6 wires sticking out in all directions and fastened a strap under his chin. Then everything went black. A very bright light came on, making his eyes burn and water. When he could see again, he was standing in front of one of the transparent walls, looking out into a giant, featureless space with no visible walls or ceiling. A bright light came from the top of a tower that he thought looked like the Space Needle in Seattle, with lights rotating around the top. Below the tower, he could see several humans, adults and children, just standing around talking casually. The entity he had met in the forest, along with another one, took him down a long walkway toward the tower. This time, Carl was floating too, just like them. They led him to a door that lifted up, and he was taken inside a large room. While inside, a shield or wall that was about 4 feet by 8 feet dropped down in front of him. then lifted back up into the ceiling. One of the entities approached him and said, "You're not what we want. We'll take you back." Then Carl was floated out of the room, back into the bright light. His eyes burned again, and the entities told him that the sun affected them the same way when they were on Earth. He was then floated inside what he called a craft, where he encountered the entity from the forest again. This time, it identified itself as Auzo 1. Auzo explained that it was also a hunter, and that its kind had been coming to Earth for many years in search of fish and animals to make into food pills. Each pill, Auzo said, could feed one of its kind for 4 days. Auzo went on to explain that their ocean had turned yellow, and all the fish had died. It showed Carl a map of its planet, which was at least partially reproduced in the symbol on its apron. It told him that the 9 planets of its solar system supplied the magnetic force for their power. Auzo examined Carl's rifle and remarked that it would have liked to keep the primitive weapon, but was not allowed to. Auzo also told Carl that their kind wore black to protect them from our sun. After the craft passed through what Carl called a dark void, he saw they had arrived back over the forest. Auzo told him it will see him. Then, to his surprise, Carl found himself floating down toward the ground. Before he landed, his foot slipped on a rock, and he fell, rolling down the hill and hurting his shoulder. Confused and disoriented, he followed a nearby road until he came upon his pickup truck, but he didn't recognize it as his own. He sat inside and heard voices on the CB radio. After figuring out how to use it, he managed to connect with someone who turned out to be his boss, Roy Fleming. Fleming asked for his name and location, but Carl was so confused he couldn't give either. He just said, "I don't know. I am so cold." He declared that he was in a pickup with a funny stick in the middle, even though he had learned to drive a stick shift years ago. Back home, Carl's wife, Marjorie, had returned from work around 4 p.m. with a growing uneasy feeling and an urge to get to her husband. She was soon alerted to Carl's distress call on the CB. Carbon County Sheriff Charles Ogburn organized a search party with Deputy Sheriff Ed Tierney and 4 local hunters. Marjorie called her friend Marilyn James, whose husband Don took them out in his truck to help. Because the roads were muddy, the sheriff's team had a hard time reaching the area where they thought Carl's pickup might be. Marjorie and her group were told to stay on a hill and wait. After a long time, Marilyn felt the truck moving and excitedly pointed to a large moving star that was changing colors. Everyone watched for about 20 minutes as the light moved in a large arc, flashing brightly and switching colors from red to green to white. Around 11:40 p.m., the search party announced they had found Carl. His truck was found about 3 miles from where he had originally parked it, stuck in a mud hole with no tire tracks leading to the site. While waiting for the searchers to return, the group noticed a big, bright red-orange light rising on the eastern horizon. They thought it was the sunrise, but later realized how unusual it was when they saw the real sunrise later that morning. When the search party returned, Marjorie immediately noticed Carl was still confused and had trouble remembering things. He had difficulty talking and didn't recognize her. She tried speaking to him, but he just looked through her as if she wasn't there. When asked if he shot an elk, Carl looked up through the windshield and said in a sing-song voice, "They took my elk. They took my elk." Carl was visibly cold, so Marjorie tried to put her coat over his shoulders, but he pulled back in fear, crying, "Don't touch me!" On the drive to Carbon County Memorial Hospital in Rawlins, Carl asked Fleming why he wasn't dressed in black, saying, "Doesn't the sun burn you?" When Carl arrived at the emergency room at 2 a.m., his eyes were watering profusely. apparently from the hospital lights. His shoulder was in pain, and he kept asking for his pills that float to you. Doctors found no bruises, bleeding, or broken bones. Test results showed no drugs in his system. Dr. R.C. Tonko determined Carl was in a state of amnesic shock. When Marjorie asked Carl his name, he replied, "They keep calling me Carl." Who is Carl? During his time at the hospital, Carl slowly started to narrate some parts of his experience, but had trouble remembering it all. Marjorie gave him a pencil and paper and told him to write down whatever he could recall. He drew a picture of the entity and wrote the word Enders. Later, the deputy sheriff mentioned that another man named Enders was in a different part of the forest that night. Carl also drew a forked road, a rough sketch of the transparent craft, listed 2 unidentified addresses, and made another note about a truck. He was released from the hospital on the morning of Monday, October 28th. X-rays found nothing concerning, even though Carl had previous X-rays showing scar tissue on his lungs from tuberculosis, and he had suffered from kidney stones before the incident, but none after. Still, for days after being rescued, he experienced headaches and back pain. When Carl spoke to a reporter from the Daily Times of Rawlins, he was still mystified by what happened, confessing that he thought he must be crazy. His boss put him in touch with a rehabilitation counselor, who suggested he speak with Dr. Leo Sprinkle, a psychologist at the University of Wyoming who was interested in UFO experiences. On November 2nd, Dr. Sprinkle drove to Carl's home for the first of several regressive hypnosis sessions. Under hypnosis, Carl was able to put more pieces of the experience together, and Dr. Sprinkle invited a local art teacher to make a drawing of Azo 1, based on Carl's description. Dr. Sprinkle went on to interview Marilyn James, Sheriff Ogburn, Dr. Tonko, Carl's nurse at the hospital, some members of the search party, and several locals. Everyone who knew Carl said he was honest and hardworking. Psychological and psychiatric tests at the university revealed no signs of mental illness. One evening, Carl suggested to Marjorie that they go for a drive with their son. Carl drove a few miles south of town, taking a dirt road up a hill, seemingly knowing where he was going. Over 150 feet in the sky above them, the family saw a bright green light shaped like a large, upside-down ice cream cone and smelled a terrible odor of dirty socks and sulfur. Dismayed, Carl announced, "I am late. I was to be here a few minutes earlier." A few nights later, Carl woke Marjorie and said, "I know it is weird. I am in bed with you. Yet I am out south of town. They are telling me, look for a black box." He felt they were telling him they could contact him whenever they wanted to, which distressed him and triggered his shoulder pain. On numerous drives to and from work, Carl was followed by lights in the sky that others also saw, and both he and Marjorie felt their phone was tapped. Carl later claimed he still had telepathic communication with Auzo on rare occasions. For example, he once told Auzo that Rawlins needed rain. The next day, it rained 3 inches, and then another 2 inches the following day, before he told Auzo to stop and the rain ceased. Carl speculated that before shooting his rifle on the day of the incident, he had entered some type of force field that slowed his bullet down. At one point, he and others returned to the location to take pictures and scan for metal, trying to find the missing lead from the bullet, but they found nothing. At the spot where the transparent box had sat, they noticed nearby leaves were burnt, and some trees in the area had strange, weathered carvings. The bullet was examined by investigators led by Dr. Walter Walker, a metallurgy consultant for the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. Walker could only conclude that it hit something hard enough to turn it inside out. The bullet was also examined by a metallurgist at the University of Wyoming, but some time later it disappeared from the university's safe. Over the years, Carl's story gained attention. A TV crew from the show In Search of visited Rawlins, as did a Japanese film crew. The National Enquirer arranged for Carl to take a polygraph test, which he passed, the first of several. Marjorie felt compelled to write Carl's story and eventually self-published a book in 2017 titled Alien Abduction of the Wyoming Hunter. In 2022, David Paulides, known for his work on missing persons cases, made a documentary about people going missing in unusual circumstances. He interviewed Carl and his wife and noted the significance of Carl being dropped at the end of his experience. Paulides pointed out that this matched hundreds of cases he had investigated where recovered bodies appeared to have been dropped from above. The fact that there were no tracks leading to the muddy spot where Carl's truck was found suggested it, too, might have been dropped. Researchers like Linda Moulton Howe have documented that many cases of animal mutilation involve carcasses with broken legs, no surrounding tracks, and impacted soil, suggesting they were also dropped. Carl believed some kind of medical examination occurred when the shield or wall dropped in front of him, and that he somehow failed the test. While he first thought he was rejected because of the effect of the light on his eyes, he later suggested it might have been because he had a vasectomy. The fact that Carl seemed to heal from his lung scarring and kidney stones is also significant. Preston Dennett has compiled over 300 cases involving spontaneous healing connected to a UFO or entity encounter, concluding that the beings are advanced extraterrestrials, neither purely benevolent nor evil, healing people for reasons beyond just testing and experimentation. There was a disappearance in the same forest almost exactly 35 years later. Mark Anthony Strittmater, a man with 15 years of hunting experience in the region, vanished on October 19, 2019. Like Carl, Mark disappeared from an area he had never hunted before. Interestingly, at the end of a previous hunt, Mark had seen a black UFO that followed him for a time. Ufologist Jacques Vallée has noted that many historical encounters with fairies, elves, and other mythical creatures involve the experiencer being offered some type of food. In some cases, people who cooperate with the fairy folk are rewarded with an inexhaustible food supply, but Irish tradition holds that if you take food from the fairy world, you become a fairy yourself and never return to the mortal realm. There are also many other UFO-related entity encounters on record where the beings float over the ground or move in unusual ways. For example, the creatures that emerged from the craft at Pascagoula, Mississippi, floated, and the so-called goblins at Kelly Hopkinsville hovered by swaying their hips back and forth. Another unusual detail is that Auzo measured the distance from its planet to Earth in light miles, rather than light years. Many UFO abduction experiences contain absurd elements like this. For instance, an Italian abductee named Pier Fortunato Zanfretta claimed that giant, gilled aliens told him they came from the third galaxy, an extremely simplistic and astronomically meaningless description. Reading Carl Higdon's account, it is easy to infer that he was meant to be taken away forever, but was unexpectedly rejected. It may be that some people who have gone missing under unusual circumstances were abducted in a similar manner and simply never returned. In other words, the kinds of missing persons cases investigated by David Paulides may be due, in part, to the same phenomenon responsible for many UFO abduction experiences and other anomalous entity encounters. Whatever reason his abductors had for rejecting Carl, it may very well have saved his life. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for listening. Carl Higdon's story is one of those cases that leaves you with more questions than answers, and honestly, that's what makes it so fascinating. If you enjoyed this video, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the channel. And if you haven't already, Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the strange, the unexplained, and the things that still don't have an explanation. Let me know in the comments. What do you think really happened to Carl out there in the woods that day? I read every single one. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.